Well, hello, hello, and welcome to the Three Books from Hearts and Minds podcast. I'm Sam Levy from the CCO, Transforming College Students to Transform the World, and I'm here, of course, with the one and only Byron Borger from Hearts and Minds Books. How are you, Byron?
I'm doing good, Sam. Thanks for letting us do this. I'm excited to talk about some books today, and I'm glad we have some listeners out there.
Yeah. Well, as this podcast episode is dropping, we are coming right off of Labor Day weekend. And so today we are going to highlight some books on work. I think a lot of folks, maybe Labor Day is, just a nice long weekend as the school year is starting, or a nice day for a kind of beginning of fall cookout. And those are great things. But Labor Day, of course, is set aside to honor and recognize the labor movement and to recognize the dignity of work and of workers. So fittingly, we wanted to talk about this subject of work. And I'll note that is a subject that is really significant both in the CCO and in our kind of ethos of campus ministry and discipleship, and also I believe for Hearts and Minds books as well. So excited to talk about a subject that I imagine was difficult to kind of pare down to three books.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, you're absolutely right. The CCO often invites college students to think Christianly about their major, to relate a biblical kind of imagination and worldview and Christian understanding of life into what it means to be a scientist or an artist or a computer engineer or a special educator, whether they're studying history or politics or science. That leads to then the vocation of calling into the work world. I mean, they're not just taking the mind of Christ into the academic world for the sake of just being a witness in the academic world, although that is important for students, but more so to prepare them to be salt and light in the workaday world where most people spend most of their time. The fact that many people, this is my hobby horse here, many people don't think about that very deeply is troubling to us. We have books on law and nursing and computers and stuff, and it's rare when Christian leaders actually commend those books to the lay people in their world. We'll talk about that a little, but if you are just coming into this podcast now and a couple of days ago celebrated Labor Day weekend at your church and didn't hear a sermon on the dignity of work and God's calling for work people to serve God in their careers, then I'm saying that your pastor is missing something and you need to use these books, maybe even give them to him or her. If you did get a good sermon on that, then you're fired up and you get it. The kingdom of God breaks into all areas of life, including the work world. So whether you did or didn't have an experience where you as an ordinary worker was honored and celebrated in Labor Day at your church, these books are going to be important. Whether you did or didn't, you either get it, or if you don't, you need to get it, because this is just so very important. My frustration as an ordinary worker, I'm a business person, is that we just don't use these books as tools for discipleship as we should. I got some great ones to tell you about. I'll start off telling you I'm wearing my necktie today because, when we opened our store 40-some years ago, we decided we were business people and we took our educational ministry seriously. In those days, college teachers all wore ties, high school teachers wore ties, and business people often. And so we have our sleeves rolled up because we do a lot of kind of heavy lifting here, literally moving stuff around and so forth, and down on our knees, crawling around, looking at shelves. But I wore a tie to sort of dignify the work and to make a statement that what we were doing was important. Times have changed and we never wear ties anymore. But the first employee we hired was a guy named Gordon Carpenter. And Gordon and I would always wear ties together and with our sleeves rolled up so we could work hard, but wearing ties to dignify our task as booksellers. So anyway, that's why I'm wearing my tie today in honor of my career and to invite other people to think faithfully about how they can bear witness in their own jobs. Have you had some interesting jobs, Sam? Before you went to work for CCO, you were working as an educator in Baltimore, and then you've had other jobs over your life. What kind of stuff have you done in your career life?
Yeah, well, most prominently, I spent 5 summers lifeguarding and teaching swimming lessons, basically living at the pool other than sleeping, and that was an always interesting job. Got to meet a lot of people that way and interact with a lot of folks. And
you save any lives? Did you save anybody?
I did. I made several rescues through the years. Usually it was small children coming out of the bottom of the water slide and couldn't quite make it with
Yeah.
the current there, or maybe some overconfident kids that thought they could make it in the diving well and got overwhelmed. Nothing super major or 911 worthy, but some.
I was never a lifeguard, but I did teach swimming lessons for a year in high school. I delivered flowers one week during spring break, working for a florist. I worked in carpentry for a while with the home builders. I had no idea what I was doing. They would send me to the tool truck to get a tool, and they would make up the name of a tool. And I would have to ask, like I knew what it was. I couldn't Google it because that was before smartphones. So I would go out to the truck and fool around. And then I'd come back and say, I'm sorry, I don't know what it is. And they would laugh at me. They just called me a college, sissy. And so I worked in that blue collar job for a while. My favorite job, maybe what like swimming was for you, I worked in a record store for a while in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, right in downtown Gettysburg. There was a record store. There was also one where I grew up in Hanover. They had two locations. And man, I sold country music, rock in the late 60s and early 70s. It was a great job. And it's where I learned to love retail, actually, working in retail. But I was selling records at this place called the Platter Palace. So yeah, I've had some interesting jobs. We could talk about that longer, but I'd love to tell folks about some books.
Yeah, let's dive in. What's the first book on the list?
Well, I'm going to cheat today. You're not supposed to cheat at work, but I'm going to cheat. I just cannot limit it to three. So I'm going to do three kinds of books, three categories of books, and I'll tell you about a few in each category. So the first category is this. We need books so we can wrap our heads around a Christian understanding of the work world. It seems in our modern world, work is either demeaned. It goes all the way back to the Greeks with Plato. It was demeaned and viewed as merely a way to make money, killing time to the weekend, work living for the weekend. Thank God it's Friday. That's a pagan saying we should not say. This idea that work is a bad thing and we're just looking for the weekend. So either we demean it or we almost make it into an idol. These days, there's some driven folks for the last 20, 30 years looking for calling and purpose, and they almost make an idol out of the desire to find purpose and meaning in their careers. So they either make an idol out of it or they make a demon out of it. And we need a biblical worldview that analyzes both the good and the bad of the work world, why it is both the only command, except for having families, given to Adam and Eve before the fall. So it's a dignified, divine thing to do. We work like God works because we're made in God's image. We build stuff. But also it is fallen. It is cursed in Genesis 3. There's thorns that infest the ground. That's not the way it's supposed to be. And Jesus came to push back those thorns so we can reclaim a dignified, proper understanding of the work world, including the injustices of the work world. You mentioned the labor union movement and the great history we have of that in our country. So the first book I want to tell you about in this genre, in this style of kind of a biblical foundation, is this cream of the crop book by Timothy Keller and a good friend named Catherine Leary Alsdorf. She co-wrote it. Her name ought to be as big as his is here. The marketers didn't quite think that, but Catherine Alsdorf was a major business executive working overseas for a while, came to faith in midlife and was mentored by Keller. And they started the Center for Faith and Work, of which there are now Centers for Faith and Work. And the classes they teach there on integrating faith and work, as they did in New York, several places throughout the country that have modeled that. And this is the book that was sort of launched, the Center for Faith and Work. We have some pieces in their website where we've given industry-specific book recommendations. So we've spoken at their conferences. I did a little workshop there once, or a little talk on being a business person. So this book by Tim Keller, Every Good Endeavor, the subtitle is Connecting Your Work to God's Work, is the cream of the crop. It's a little heady, it's a little thick, but it is the best by far to get our groundwork on a Christian view of that. In that same genre, I would say this is one that's just wonderful. Brian Dyke, D-I-K, a PhD, came out of Calvin College originally. He's working now in the psychology field. He has another book on the psychology of vocation and calling, what it means to sort of think emotionally about all that. But this book called Redeeming Work, A Guide to Discovering God's Calling for Your Career, is by Brian Dyke, a PhD. It's on Templeton Press, really fascinating publishing house. One thing that's interesting about this is in this book, there is a free link to what he calls Pathway University. Pathway U is a job site sort of stuff. He does some career counseling. And there's something called jobzology, Jobz, jobzology, which is a thing he created to help people sort of discern their own sense of calling and vocation in the world, their strengths and their weaknesses and their passions and their expectations. And so you can find how to kind of find your own career path through this pathway and through this jobzology link that's in this book. This is really, really solid stuff. A number of people that I admire have endorsed it and have been quoted in it. It's not terribly well known. This Templeton Press is a semi-scholarly press, but this is a real readable book. Love it. It's a great tool. And so this is another one that just shows sort of the biblical basis for redeeming work. We have probably 50 different books on that topic in our store that are like this theological foundation. But in this first genre, I'll say one other one. It is called Work Worth Doing. And I say this one in part because it's really a simple read. Both of these are a little more serious, not that they're that hard. They're not academic books, but they're meaty. This has got just a little more lively feel, a little more, a few white pages, some pull quotes and graphics inside. It's designed for young people, I think. You have this sense it's for college students wanting to get a vision for their careers and making sure they're in a job area that's going to suit them well. Work Worth Doing, Finding God's Direction and Purpose for Your Career. The author is Tom Heetderks, Heetderks, Heetderks. This is published by Harvest House. Real easy to read, real fun, has some diagrams, has lots of stories. If you're in a blue-collar field, not going off to college, but wanting to just work with your hands and that sort of stuff, this would also be really, really useful. Work Worth Doing. Let me just say one other thing. There's a book that I absolutely adore that I always put on a list of the top 3 or 4 books in this field. It is called Work Matters. It's by a guy named Tom Nelson. Unlike these others, this is actually written by a pastor. And Tom says in this book that as a pastor, he was so interested in the many interesting career areas in his church, but he always invited them to work for the church, like the business people he would recruit to do fundraising and financial stuff. Educators would obviously teach in Sunday school, you know, that kind of thing. And finally, he realized that what he ought to be doing is equipping those people with a kingdom vision that was so robust and energetic and missional that they would want to serve God as teachers and as business people, not merely in the church, not just artists doing church art, but actually working in their fields respectively. And so he says, I was committing pastoral malpractice. That's the phrase he uses as a pastor that doesn't equip the flock to serve God in the workaday world. And he repents of that. He's very honest about how he simply didn't do that kind of work. You know, the story is told, and I've heard it said myself, that a person was at a Sunday school class or a church service, and in September, they were going to invite the Sunday school teachers to come up forward in front of the worship service, lay hands on them and pray for them as they commissioned them to be Sunday school teachers. And this was a beautiful thing, and it's a good thing to do, absolutely a good thing to do. But the Sunday school teacher said, you know, I'm a public school teacher. I work 40 hours a week in the public schools. And every year they ask me to come up and they pray for me because I work for 1 hour a week with the church children. But they never once have prayed about me doing my 40-hour-a-week work world teaching children in the public schools. And why is it that we'll pray for when the teacher teaches the children in the church, but they don't pray for them when they do their vocation and calling in the public school system? So anyway, that's what this book sort of gets at. And one of the ways he does that is he has sidebars telling the stories of various people in his church: architects, school teachers, CPAs, various kind of career areas, any kind of lawyers. Talks about those and lets them tell their own story. I know some of those people, actually. This book has now gone out of print. So if you want it, we have a couple left. It is being reissued, expanded, and redeveloped, new cover, coming out next April. So it's going to be almost a year till it comes out in a new edition. We're glad for that. But I have a few of the old ones left if anybody wants. It's published by Crossway, Connecting Sunday Worship to Monday Work. So there you go. That's the first style of book. Foundational books from a Christian perspective that give you a biblical view of work. That's the number 1. I listed 4.
That's great. So what is our second category then?
Well, the second category are books I'm going to just say are a little more on the practical side, offering this biblical vision, but kind of working it out in more detail, what it kind of looks like on the ground. And again, there's a lot of those that I'll list. The first one I almost put in the first category. It's so foundational and it's so good. It's one of my absolute favorites in this genre. Just came out this year, and we've been selling books like this for 40 years. And when one comes out that's really at the cream of the crop, I'd like to celebrate it. It is called Working from the Inside Out. It's by a guy named Jeff Haanen, who runs the Denver Institute on Faith and Work. Really thoughtful guy. I love Jeff. He has a couple other little books. And this is very much about your interior life and what kind of inner resources you need if you're going to develop a Christian perspective and sense of practice that's distinctively faithful in the workaday world. So working from the inside out, a brief guide to inner work that transforms our outer world. There's something about how to have impact, how to have success in the marketplace that needs more than just sort of seemingly secular skill sets. You need some interior virtue, some passion, some spirituality. Phil Yancey, who doesn't blurb a lot of books, has a blurb in the back of this. Our friend Tom Nelson, that I just mentioned, has an endorsement. Catherine Leary Alsdorf, who co-wrote the big book that Keller gets the credit for, she has a blurb in the back of this. I mean, it is really one of the most important books in this whole genre. He looks at the disintegration, the fragmentization that we have between our prayer life and our public life, and then the reintegration of that, and what it looks like to seek spiritual health that's holistic and relational, and how it can help us create good work and serve others well. And then there's actually a third section on change, how we can actually take steps to make that happen. So this is about the spirituality of work, the inner virtue of the landscape of our interior lives, if we're going to make something happen in the work world. Another one is sort of like it. It is called Make Work Matter. It's by a woman named Michaela O'Donnell, who is at the Dupree Center at Fuller Seminary. Max Dupree ran a furniture business, was high-end, esteemed for years, Max Dupree, and funded a chair on leadership studies at Fuller Theological Seminary. And that Max Dupree Center is very much about sort of faith in the work world stuff and leadership development for leaders in the business entrepreneurial space. And she is the director of that program. And this Make Work Matter, the subtitle is Your Guide to Meaningful Work in a Changing World. It's a woman writer, which is valuable, but she looks at stuff like your creativity, your resilience, your relationships in the marketplace. You have to believe that you're called, of course, and you have to be empathetic. She has a thing about practicing empathy with your colleagues and your clients and your workers and your bosses and your people you supervise. So this is a book you could put it in the leadership category, you could put it in the business category, you could put it in the workspace category. And work that makes a difference has got to be rooted in some real practical skills that is more than just, being an effective leader. And I love that book. Here's another one that's real practical, and I just love this book. I mentioned that this is written by a woman. Many of the books, at least in recent years, until just recent years, have been written by men in the marketplace. This is a little book that I know our friend Bob Robinson, who has a great, great podcast people should listen to, Reintegrate. He has had her on his Reintegrate podcast. It's a woman named Joanne Meyer, Meyer. It's a little book published by InterVarsity Press and also came out of the Denver Institute. She's a colleague of Jeff Hannen's at the Denver Institute. And Joanna wrote this book for women. It's called Women, Work, and Calling, Step into Your Place in God's World. It does have the foundational theology, the foundational vision, the kingdom stuff about incarnational living and all that good stuff. But then it gets real practical about how you live that out, particularly for women with certain hurdles and opportunities and problems in the workaday world. The stuff here about realizing your vocational power, about building what she calls humble confidence, about analyzing some stuff that, particularly for women, that are sort of keeping them from growing and stepping up into the workaday world. It is really good. She talks about being relationally generous, which means being open to mentoring others and so forth, and how you handle mentorship. I mean, this book has more good stuff in it. I think men should read it, but it's certainly good for women. Women, Work, and Calling, Step into Your Place in God's World. So that's another one in that more practical side. Here's another one in this second genre of books about practicality. It's called Faith at Work, Christian Vocations in the Professions. Now, granted, these are about kind of white-collar professional career areas, and the first part is very broad. All these guys are Lutheran, by the way. It's published by Concordia Press, which is a conservative Lutheran company. And so they've got a traditionalist, conservative Lutheran kind of perspective. But even if you're not Lutheran, this is good stuff. Listen to the first section. The working God of the Old Testament, the working God of the New Testament. Vocation, work, and human flourishing. And then a chapter on economic systems and human flourishing from a Lutheran perspective. And then how to preach to professionals in a secular world. That's for pastors. Okay, that's just the first couple of chapters. Then here's where it gets practical. It has professions as vocations. And there's a chapter called The Heart of the Counselor. There's another one called Faith in Nursing. The next one is the vocation of teaching. The next one is a vocation of service. It's about healthcare administrators. Very large career in our world. Serving God in public health professions. Man, that's important, and increasingly so. We learned during COVID, public health stuff. Coaching as a vocation. What's it mean to be an athletic coach? Isn't that cool? A vocation of law and the pursuit of justice, a Christian approach to working in the business world. There's even a chapter on the vocation of a pharmacist. Now, some of this sounds a little random, and if your career isn't represented here, it comes close to almost everybody's sort of career. I think this is a great sort of thing that could be in church libraries, that you could read a couple of the chapters, you could photocopy them and send them to the person you know who's a pharmacy major or interested in public health, or a coach or a scientist, business person. So that's like a great way into this broader conversation of what it looks like to serve God in the practical ways of the ordinary world. So that Faith at Work, it's edited by somebody named David Loy, L-O-Y, and it's published by Concordia. So that's my second genre, the theological foundations, and then some more practical stuff that gets at the nitty gritty of what it looks like. Can I give you a third set of books here before we wrap up?
Absolutely. So we've looked at the kind of general theology of vocation, why this matters. We've looked at kind of more practical, on the ground, how to live this out kind of stuff. What's our third category?
The third category is the genre of memoir or biography about people that talk about their work. I love this kind of stuff, and there are so many interesting ones. I'm just going to tell you about a few, and I'll only say a few words about them. I'll try not to go on, or we'll be here for 3 hours. But for those listening on Apple or Spotify, or those of us that are watching, I'm going to hold up the book titles, and you could order these. We have them at Hearts and Minds, of course, or others like them. The first one is called The Lost Carving, A Journey into the Heart of Making. It's by a guy named David Easterly. It's published by Penguin Books, a mainstream sort of secular publisher. This story is so fascinating. This David Easterly, years ago as a kid, was in Europe and was touring with his family, major old cathedral from the medieval days, you know, King Henry and the Reformation and all that. He looks at this glorious old cathedral, and there's woodwork in it. And he's so taken with the woodwork that he decides he wants to take that up as a hobby and eventually as a career. And he becomes a master craftsman in the woodworking field. That in itself is worth the price of the book, how a young person can sort of step into a passion in the arts and learning to be a maker, but a blue-collar wood crafter. Well, here's where the story gets really interesting. The cathedral burns down, and they need to find somebody to recreate it. And they don't even know about the fact that his own calling into this field happened because he looked at that exact cathedral. Sort of through circumstance, he ends up being the guy to rebuild the very cathedral that turned him on to the craft of woodworking in the first place. Isn't that fascinating? Wow. In God's serendipitous timing is called by Laura Miller in the back, profound and wondrous, rich in thought and lovely in style. Easterly is that uncommon thing, a visual artist who can coax as much beauty from words as he can from his primary medium. It is breathtaking. This is a great book for artists, for vocational people, for people wanting to find their calling, just for somebody that's interested in woodworking. Love that book. It's a great story of an example of somebody stepping into the great meaning and passion of finding their role in life and then doing the career, the job of a lifetime, fixing up this cathedral that burned down. Let me tell you about another one that is very different, but again, kind of a blue collar guy. This really is one of my all-time favorite books. I've reviewed this on many Labor Days. I've done big, long book lists on books about faith and work. And I've often mentioned this, even though there's not much religion in it as such. But it's an example of a business leader fighting the economic powers that be, taking a stand and making a difference up against all odds. It is written by a wonderful journalist named Beth Macy. Beth is a journalist from the South, from Southern Virginia, and she became particularly well known and won a number of awards for a book called Dope Sick, which was made into a Netflix thing about the Sattler family and their opioid crisis and all the crap that they pulled. She wrote a second one following that up about the ways in which we can raise Lazarus, as she puts it, people that are helping those that are addicted on the streets after the opioid crisis moved to heroin, fentanyl. So she's a caring, passionate writer that covers blue-collar lives and stuff like that. Well, here's a book that she wrote called Factory Man. It is about a furniture manufacturer in the Carolinas, and most people know that the Carolinas are sort of one of the top places, except maybe for Michigan, that makes the best furniture in the world. They began to see at the end of the 20th century jobs going overseas, factories shutting down, the furniture industry crumbling, people being laid off, leading to stuff like the opioid crisis when unemployed. They weren't Rust Belt towns, but towns that have the same feel as the Ohio Rust Belt, these vacating towns that were once vibrant communities where their job sources were dying off. Well, one guy who ran one of these factories decided that he wasn't going to let it happen on his watch. He was going to figure out why the prices were coming down, what was going on with overseas stuff to China. And he decides to go to China to find out how they have ripped off and mimicked classic American furniture design, done it cheaply with poor wood and shoddy workmanship, but shipping it back then into the States and ruining their not high-end, but their significant, wonderful furniture legacy of skilled workers and then factory workers. It's called Factory Man, how one furniture maker battled offshore, stayed local, and helped save an American town. This guy is a hero in my book, and Beth Macy wrote the story about all this. It's a well-crafted, epic, just an epic tale. She's done incredible research into it, and I think anybody that's interested in sort of reviving industry or caring about small towns or studying the global economy. This guy lived in Bassett, Virginia, in the late 1980s, when the first waves of Asian competition hit. And then by the knees, everybody's shutting down their plants. He said, we're not going to shut down this plant. And with just remarkable, epic courage, he ends up going to China to track down the factories and see what he could do about these sort of hidden truths in the industrial sector in American economy. I love this book, and it's really an example of what we need: more whistleblowers and reform agents that aren't just putting on a nice pious face when they go to work and they don't cheat, but actually changing the face of the industry and standing particularly for the workers and the quality of the craftsmanship. She gets it as she tells the story of this guy that is a hero in my book. So Factory Man is the name of that book. Let me tell you about one more. It's a book that I have some personal connection to. A guy named Wayne Alderson, who since died, was an industrial manager in a steel plant outside of Pittsburgh. When I worked for the CCO, I worked in McKeesport, a steel mill town just outside of Pittsburgh, and just down the river was this place where he worked. He was a Presbyterian. I knew which church he went to. I knew Wayne Alderson is his name. I knew Wayne when we were in Western Pennsylvania. And as a worker at this plant called Pitron, which had terrible work relations. People would get drunk after work. The racial tensions were bad. There were strikes. He came in as a manager and said, we're gonna turn this place around with treating people with dignity. And he began to do that. He worked on racial reconciliation. He worked on ethics. He worked on respect. He would go to the bars and track down the blue-collar workers after their shift and try to get them to go home to their wives. He was an amazing kind of blue-collar guy that worked for the company, but he didn't always do what the company wanted because he knew that the thriving nature of the corporation and the plant depended on the dignity of the workers caring about their workplace. He started a Bible study, in fact, and there was a movie made, a documentary made called The Miracle of Pitron, because there was an accident where the molten steel went through the plant and nobody died, but it was a terrible molten mess. And it ran right over a Bible and it was hardly even singed. You can see the picture. I've seen it, of this Good News for Modern Man paperback Bible they used in the workplace Bible study that had just tinged edges, but somehow, through a miracle, lasted through the fire. Well, anyway, he turned that plan around. And this is the story of him doing that. It's an incredible personal memoir, a biography written by a theologian who was a Presbyterian leader back in those days named R.C. Sproul. Sproul eventually left the Western Pennsylvania area and started a nationally known Reformed theological ministry in Orlando, Florida, still called the Ligonier Ministries. So Ligonier is a town in Pennsylvania where R.C. lived. And Sproul got interested in Wayne Alderson and wrote this book about him. It's called Stronger Than Steel. And he began a program, ultimately, of trying to bring reconciliation between labor and management. There was a terrible, terrible strike in one winter. I think it was 79. I was still working in McKeesport. Maybe it was 80. And he decided to have a prayer meeting where he would get Christians who were in labor and who were in management to embrace publicly and pray on Market Square in downtown Pittsburgh. Bomb threats were called into the event. They tried to stop it in all kinds of ways. Management didn't want it to happen. The union didn't want it to happen. And he said, if we can get these guys together and show that they're humans together and on the same team, we could break this strike, which actually happened. It became a national news story. Well, this is a heck of a book, Stronger Than Steel, by R.C. Sproul, about Wayne Alderson. What a guy in the work world. What a ministry of the dignity of labor. He went on to become then a consultant and worked in Volkswagen plants and all kind of place, teaching what he called Theory R. It was a leadership model based on respect. So that's a great book for anybody in the work world, but particularly those in the blue-collar labor union space, of how a Christian perspective can be liberating and full of all kind of changing the world kind of vision. The implications of his simple respect just rippled out into the economy and into factories all over Western Pennsylvania. So we were proud to know Wayne Alderson and glad that Sproul wrote this book about him. Sproul is mostly known for serious, heady Reformed theology, but here he gets really down and dirty, telling the story of a management guy in a steel mill. Isn't that great?
Oh yeah, what a story!
What a story!
All of those sound like really fascinating page turners and great examples of people living this stuff out in real life, even in ordinary ways.
Yeah. Exactly. I'm going to close with just one more in this kind of practical space, and I won't say much about it, but it has really won some awards. The paperback has a new afterword by the author, who's a great Baltimore economist, business scholar. The book is called Fulfillment. The subtitle is America in the Shadow of Amazon. There's been other major business books critiquing Amazon and their foul play in the marketplace and some of the shenanigans they pulled. What this is mostly about is the fulfillment centers and the ways in which Amazon will get government grants, not unlike baseball stadiums and football stadiums, government grants and promises for tax cuts and stuff, if they bring a fulfillment center into the community, because it's going to give jobs. Well, those jobs end up becoming often dehumanizing, even though sometimes Amazon treats the people well, sometimes not. It's curious, they're union busters and all that. But they do have some good programs for their workers, but it ends up being a net loss for the community. We give them all this money so they get tax breaks so they can come in and hire people. But the number of people that are displaced in the small economic retail space because of the Amazon plant ends up being a net loss of taxes, a net loss of jobs, and a hurt to the local economy. This economic problem of having one major company ruining our economy is what's talked about here. But even more so, he looks at the human side of that, the people that work in these fulfillment centers, the kind of jobs they have, the kind of work they do, the kind of construction that has to happen in the neighborhoods as they build these big fulfillment centers. There's one here in York now. There's some up in your way over Lancaster side and some over where you grew up in Chambersburg. I mean, they're all over the place now. And then the trucking industry that does that and helps ship stuff. So everything from the shippers to the truckers to the fulfillment centers, this is analyzing just this brave new economy of the gig economy and the worker economy that's run mostly by Amazon and the richest guy in the world. So this is a thrilling book. Alec McGillis is the author. It's called Fulfillment. It's a deeply humanizing book that shows what workers go through in the Amazon work world space. So anyway, that's quite a read. I really was impressed by it. One of the sections for anybody local here that knows Hearts and Minds that is interested in this, he looks at the South York shopping area. There's a plaza on Queen Street we call the Queen Street Plaza. There was a Bon-Ton there, which was a major regional chain that Amazon put out of business over the years. And it looks at the history of the Bon-Ton chain, which is in central Pennsylvania. Boscov's is another chain that's known, a department store in the central Pennsylvania area. And it looks at the history of Bon-Ton, the rise of the Queen Street Shopping Center, which is 4 miles up the road from us, and what happened to that shopping space, and particularly to the Bon-Ton chain over the years as Amazon took over that retail space. So anyway, it's a really interesting read, a really good book, and it's been a New York Times editor's pick for one of the best books of the year a couple of years ago when it first came out. So that's another one about some of the stuff we're facing here in the work world, and our bookstore feels it, of course. And we're looking for people to make a difference in the work world, and these books are going to help people do it. We're excited to celebrate Labor Day by talking about these very kind of books.
Yeah. Well, if you listeners are interested in making a difference and understanding a deeper vision for why your work matters, there's a lot of resources that we were just given. So we thank you so much for listening. We would love for you to order one or more of these books. There's, I think, in this list, we have something for everybody, right? Everyone is touched and impacted by this topic. I think of the often quoted line from Annie Dillard that how we spend our days is how we spend our lives. And for most of us, whether it's paid work or not, work, vocation is a large part of how we spend our days and our lives. And so there's something for everybody here. So the first link in the episode description will take you to where you can place an order from Hearts and Minds. We'd love for you to like and share this podcast, get the word out. And we love to hear from listeners. So if you want to continue this conversation, feel free to contact Byron or myself. Read these books, share in the comments or in an email to us what you think and your thoughts. So for Byron, Hearts and Minds, and the CCO, this has been another episode of the 3 Books from Hearts and Minds podcast.
Thanks, everybody.